So what do you got here for me?
So we were going to talk about, I was really interested to talk to you because we talked last time about my book about depression, lost connections. And one of the things that was suggested to me is we talk about the book I wrote about addiction and the war on drugs. And I really...
Was that out last time you came?
Yeah. So that was a book that came out a few years ago. It's just come out in a new edition where there's loads of extra material, particularly about the opioid crisis. And it's interesting because...
So you added to it?
Yeah, loads of new stuff, because that book's about 5 years old now, and although with loads of new stuff now. But, you know, it was something I cared about for this really personal reason, in that one of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. I didn't understand why then, because I was a little boy. But as I got older, I realised we had drug addiction in my family. And it got to the point where I was writing Chasing the Scream, my book about the drug war, I guess I started 8 years ago. And some of the people I love were in a really shitty condition, terrible state. And I was trying to figure out what to do. Nothing I was doing was working. Nothing I was doing was helping. And I decided, right, okay, well, there are lots of people all over the world who are trying to deal with this problem. I want to go and meet with them, talk with them. So I ended up going on this big journey. It took 3 years. I traveled over 30,000 miles. I wanted to sit with, people who'd been through addiction. It actually led to a lot of other aspects of the war on drugs, which I think are as important as what we do about addiction. And I wanted to sit with the places that had the harshest possible policies, like we mentioned Arizona, where I went out with these women who were made to go out on chain gangs and are humiliated and tormented. Vietnam, where they make people with addiction problems go into literally forced labor camps. And the places that had the most compassionate possible policies, like Portugal, where they decriminalised all drugs with incredible results. Switzerland, where they legalised heroin, incredible results. And I guess I ended up just spending so much time with such a crazy mixture of people, from a transgendered crack dealer in Brooklyn who ended up actually being one of the smartest people I know, to a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel, who's definitely not one of the smartest people I know. And I learned loads of things, but I guess the heart of what I learned is just so much of what we've been told about this for so long. It's now 100 years since we started fighting the war on drugs in this country, and it was then imposed on the rest of the world. So much of what we're told is wrong. Drugs aren't what we think they are. Addiction isn't what we think it is. The war on drugs isn't what we think it is. And the alternatives to the war on drugs aren't what we think they are. So in some ways, it's kind of daunting to go all over the world and realise so much of what we take for granted isn't right, but that opens up this whole exciting other set of possibilities.
The main reason why people assume that people do drugs is to escape reality. What do you think is the primary thing that they're running from?
So you've got to separate out two things. And this surprised me because my family's experience was pretty bad and catastrophic addiction. But most drug use, even the main drug war body in the world, the UN Office of Drug Control, admits that 90% of all currently banned drug use is what they call non-problematic. So the person isn't addicted and it doesn't damage their health, right? So 90%. So let's set that aside. We'll come back to that.
Okay.
There's like 90% that's recreational use, where people use because it makes their lives better.
Right.
Then you've got the
like coffee, sip of wine at work, or dinner,
ecstasy, or a whole range of currently cannabis, a whole range of currently illegal drugs. In most cases, there are some people who have addictions to cannabis. But you then got to ask, well, what's happening with this 10% who have got a problem, right? What's going on? And one of the things that really blew my mind in the research for Chasing the Scream was realizing I had deeply misunderstood what addiction is. I had misunderstood the thing I thought I had been seeing in front of me since I was a kid, right? So most people, let's think about heroin addiction because that was close to me. Most people, if we stop the next 20 people to walk past your studio and we said to them, what causes heroin addiction? I think they'd look at us like we were stupid and they'd say, well, the clue's in the name, dipshit, right? Heroin causes heroin addiction. We've been told this story for 100 years. It's become totally part of our common sense, right? We think if we took the next 20 people after that who walked past this studio and we injected them all with heroin every day for a month, at the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically need. And we think that, a lot of people think that's what addiction is, right? It's this physical hunger for the chemical hook inside the drug, right? There is some reality to chemical hooks. They exist, they're real, but that's actually a very small part of what's going on. The first thing that alerted me to the fact there's something wrong with that story we've been told is when it was explained to me by loads of doctors in Britain, where I'm from. if you step out into the street and you get hit by a truck and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital and you'll be given loads of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin, right? It's the medical name for heroin. It's the stuff you'll be given in hospital is much better than the shit you buy on the street because it's medically pure. It's, not contaminated. If what we think about addiction is right, that it's just caused by exposure to the drug, what should be happening to all these people in British hospitals who are being given loads of heroin, right? Anyone watching this podcast who's got a British grandmother who's had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother's taken a shit ton of heroin, right? If what we think is right, that addiction is caused primarily by exposure to the chemical hooks, loads of these people should be leaving hospital and trying to score on the streets, right? This has been studied very carefully. It virtually never happens, right? And when I learned that, it just seems so weird to me. I thought it couldn't possibly be true, right? How could it be you've got someone in a hospital bed who's taking loads of really potent heroin, they don't become addicted, and in the alleyway outside, you got someone who's using actually a weaker form of the drug who becomes addicted. How can that be? What's happening here? And I only began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and met this amazing man called Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment that's really transformed how we think about addiction all over the world. It's led to a new way of thinking and loads of new evidence. So Professor Alexander explained to me this story that we've been told, right, that addiction is caused by the chemical hooks primarily, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your viewers can try them at home if they're feeling a little bit shitty today, right? You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. You might remember in the 1980s, there's a famous Partnership for Drug-Free America ad that shows this experiment, right? And the rat in this cage starts to drink always prefers the heroin water, and almost always kills itself within a week or two, right? So there you go. That's our story. You're exposed to the drug, it takes you over, and then you just die, right? But in the 70s, Professor Alexander comes along and says he was working with people with addiction problems. And he's like, well, hang on a minute. We put these rats alone in an empty cage. They've got nothing that makes life meaningful for rats, right? What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically like heaven for rats, right? They got loads of friends, they got loads of cheese, they got loads of coloured balls, they can have loads of sex. Anything a rat finds meaningful in life is there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drug water, and of course they try both. They don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the water very much. None of them ever use it compulsively.
The heroin water.
Yeah, the heroin water. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. So you go from almost 100% compulsive use and death by overdose when their lives are shitty to none when they have the things that make life meaningful. Now, there's loads of human examples I'm sure we'll talk about, but the main thing I took from this is that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. We have to ask ourselves, what are the contexts in which people become addicted? Because there are some contexts where people find these drugs extremely addictive, and there are some contexts where they don't become addicted at all. There's something, the drug plays a role. Chemical hooks are real. I can talk about how we know that. They play some role, but they're actually a surprisingly small role of small amount of what's going on. We know this from, there's so many examples, but I'll give you another one. At the same time as Rat Park, there was an experiment going on that everyone listening to this will have heard of, the Vietnam War, right? In Vietnam, shitloads of American troops were using heroin, right? It was very easy to get it out there. Insanely, they had cracked down on cannabis, and so people had moved to heroin because sniffer dogs can't detect heroin as easily as cannabis. So cannabis was everywhere. Heroin was everywhere. Loads of American troops were using it. And if you look at what people said at the time, the authorities, the Nixon White House, they were shitting themselves because they believe this chemical hooks theory of addiction. So they're like, fuck, when this war ends, we're going to have, 500,000 heroin addicts on the streets of the United States. There was a really good study that followed these men home, and it found that the vast majority of them just stopped, right? They didn't go to rehab, most of them. They didn't go into horrific withdrawal. Some of them had an uncomfortable flu-like symptoms, but most of them just stopped. Now, if you believe this old theory that chemical hooks take you over, that makes no sense. But if you understand what Professor Alexander is saying and that all the new evidence about addiction that I go through in Chasing the Scream, it makes perfect sense, right? You, me, everyone in this area, if I took any of us and put us in a horrific pestilential jungle where we don't want to be, and I made you kill a load of people and potentially die at any moment, you would find heroin much more appealing than you do now, right? If we want to understand why people turn to painkillers, we've got to understand why they're in pain, right? And the core of addiction, I learned from these amazing experts all over the world, the core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. And once you understand that, you can see why what we've been doing is such a disaster, right? Because the theory we have with the war on drugs, think about Arizona, we can talk about that more, but like I say, I went to this nightmare prison, Estrella prison in Phoenix, Arizona, where people are humiliated. And the theory behind that, part of the theory behind the war on drugs is, if you've got people who are addicted, you've got to inflict pain on them to, give them an incentive to stop, right? But once you understand that pain is in fact the fuel of addiction, is in fact the primary cause of addiction, you can see why sometimes people say that doesn't work. Truth is much worse, right? That makes addiction worse. Those women I went out with and spent all that time with who were, humiliated. I remember in that prison, we come back from being on the chain gang where sometimes they have to dig graves. They weren't doing that the day I was there. They had to collect garbage one of the days I was there. But we come back, and normally with prisons, as a journalist, they don't want to show you anything, right? You have to kind of really finagle to get them to show you anything. In this prison, it's like a pantomime of cruelty. They want to show it to you. The whole point is to humiliate these people, right? So the women I'd been talking to and the men were really terrified of what they called the hole, right? It's the solitary block. And so I said to the guards, will you show me the hole? I was sure they'd say no. They're like, yeah, sure, come on, we'll show you. So we go around to the hole, and these women who put there for the most trivial infractions, like having a cigarette, it's literally a hole, right? It's like a concrete block. You're on your own. There's nothing in it. There's a tiny window where you can see sunlight. No TV, nothing. And I remember speaking to a woman who was in this and suddenly thinking, this is the closest you could get to an exact human recreation of the cages that guaranteed addiction in rats, right? And this is what we're doing, thinking it will stop these women being addicted. It's the system we've built. Dr. Gabor Mate, an amazing guy, said to me, if negative consequences stopped addiction, there wouldn't be a single addict in the world, right? What have people with addiction problems not suffered? What humiliation have they not endured? So we've got this... I think we've got to really shift our perspective on what addiction is, and there are places that have done this that have led to incredible results.
I love that rat experiment one, because that had always been parroted as this is the proof positive that these drugs are so terrible for you. But once they figured out that if you take those rats and put them in a wonderful place and they don't have addiction, it really does make you step back and go, okay, what is exactly going on here? Obviously, there's chemical hooks. They are real. Like people that are on sustained, prolonged use of opiates, especially people with back injuries, have an incredibly difficult time kicking them. Even really positive people who don't necessarily have awful lives. But it's one of those things that gets in your head and then you sort of parrot it. You've heard it, you repeat it. But it's the reason why I asked you the question. It's like what is the cause? For most people, you believe it's an unfulfilled life or a painful life or a painful self-image or remorse for your past, or like what is it? Do we have like primary reasons or primary attributes that we attach to these people that are drug addicted?
Yeah, so this was what my more recent book, which is called Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions is about. Because I think the core of addiction is about trying to deal with pain.
Right.
But the causes of human pain are obviously huge. But what I learned is there's scientific evidence for 9 causes of kind of deep despair, right?
Okay.
Now, if you think about depression, and very similar factors play out with addiction, they're actually densely interconnected phenomena. But there are real biological factors, right? Your genes can make you more vulnerable to that, just like some people find it easier to put on weight than others.
Right.
And there are real brain changes that happen when you become depressed or addicted that can make it harder to get out, right? But most of the factors that are causing this despair are not factors in our biology, they're factors in the way we live. I think it's a kind of... This doesn't cover all of the causes that I learned about for Lost Connections, but it covers a lot of them. Everyone watching your show knows they have natural physical needs, obviously, right? You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. Exactly. If I took those things away from you, you'd be fucked really quickly, right? But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs, right? You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And this culture we've built is good at lots of things, and I'm really glad to be alive today for all sorts of reasons. I had to go to the dentist the other day. I'm glad to be alive now, not like 100 years ago. But there's a lot of evidence that we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs.